Shalom Bethel family and other friends who like to watch our weekly review of the Torah portion here at Congregation Bethel in Norfolk. It is time again for our review from last week. Last week in synagogue we read Parshat Korach. Korach coming right around the middle of the book of Bamidbar and highlighting this wild story when a Levite Korach, a Levite prince really, head of his family, rises up in rebellion, supported by some Reubenites, and they rise up in rebellion against Moshe and against Aaron, saying to them, "You take too much upon yourselves, for the entire congregation all are holy, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you raise yourselves above the assembly?" Several times over the course of the portion of the story, it's pointed out that these are Levites who are rebelling, members of Moshe's own tribe. It seems that Moshe is learning a lesson that I learned once in a story. I can't remember which prime minister and which president, but that the president of the United States was meeting with an Israeli prime minister, and the president said, being a leader in American democracy is very hard. You have millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who think they're your boss. And the prime minister responds and says, "Mr. President, that sounds like a very great difficulty, but, Israeli democracy is even harder. Here we have millions of people, each of whom thinks he's the prime minister." And that is clearly what Korach and his minions seem to be claiming against Moshe, that they have every right to be the leader just as much as Moses. Among the many troubling things about this rebellion in the desert is the question of why did the Levites lead this rebellion? Right, the rest of the Jewish people, the Israelites, have been complaining and rebelling literally since they crossed the Red Sea. But the Levites were always the ones who had Moshe's back. Right, they're the ones who Moshe calls on when after the sin of the golden calf, he needs people to chase down and to fight the religious rebels and zealots there. And it's the Levites who rise to his aid. And it's the Levites who have the special religious role all through the desert. And it makes sense. The Levites are Moshe's tribesmen. They're his cousins. They are the ones who you would expect to be closest to him. And now all of a sudden we have this incident where it's the Levites who are leading the rebellion. And it's very hard to understand why exactly. In fact, it's so tricky that medieval commentators grapple with the story. Ibn Ezra goes so far as to move the location of the story. There's this idea that stories don't necessarily happen in the order in which they are written in the Torah. So he says, this actually happened all the way back at Mount Sinai. And the reason why the Levites rebel here is because they are upset at Mount Sinai that Moses picked Aaron to be the Kohen, thinking he was showing favoritism to his brother. Okay, maybe. I mean, that would be a reason that they would rebel. It makes more sense than them rebelling later on when nothing really has changed. The Ramban, Nachmanides, comes later and says, no, you can't just say it's willy-nilly out of order here. You have to have a reason for that. He says, no, this comes actually exactly in this place. And the reason that the Korachites are so upset is because Moses failed to defend the people against God after the sin of the spies. And they now realize that they will not be able to enter the land of Israel, the punishment from last week's Parsha in Shlach when the incident of the spies took place. And so they suddenly rise up because they now realize that they won't ever get to the promised land, only their children will, and they somehow blame Moses for that fact. But I'd like to propose maybe a third option, and this one is based on modern sociological theory, right? It's called Granovetter's threshold theory. And what Mark Granovetter did was he proposed this threshold model of why mobs form and why people do things in the context of a mob that they never would do outside of that context, right? So why would someone who you would think never would be violent in the context of a mob might suddenly be extraordinarily violent? And the reverse works also. In a crowd where everyone is doing something good, someone who maybe doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about others might get swept up in doing a good thing. So how do we explain that? And Granovetter says it's this threshold theory. What it says is that the threshold is the number or proportion of others who must make one decision before another given actor does so. Right? So basically, our decision making is not so much based on our values and our morals and our ethics in a moment like that, but in fact is more based on what other people are doing. And depending on how many other people are doing the thing, you are more likely to do it yourself. Right? So, for example, a radical, right, who is a rabble rouser, we might call them, has a very low threshold. But someone else might have a threshold of 2 or 3 people. So after the radicals get going, they join in. But now there's 5 or 10 people, and now that draws other people who will only join in when they see 5 or 10 people, and that multiplies and multiplies to the snowball effect, and suddenly you have a mob decision-making process. But what's so important about what Granovetter says is that the threshold, once it is broken, cancels out other ethical norms, which we see. I mean, we know that this is true. And of course, there are a lot of other factors that can influence this as well, right? Why might a teenager with 3 friends in his car suddenly be encouraged by them to drive 100 miles an hour and be reckless? Well, maybe some teenagers have a threshold of only 3, but of course that threshold is lowered if there's been alcohol involved or, and other outside factors. So I think this threshold theory also explains to us what is going on with Korach and his followers. So Korach might be a radical, one Levite who's been waiting, as Nachmanides describes it, been waiting for just the right moment to rise up. But what about the rest of these Levites? They're loyal to Moses. And most of these other tribesmen as well, the Reubenite princes who join in. So what happens? How do they get caught up in such a bad decision? The answer is that as this rebellion snowballs, as more and more people come to their cause, it cancels out their normal ethical decision-making process, and they're caught up in this mob mentality and this rebellion. And they pay the ultimate price. One mistake is sometimes all it takes, whether you're a group of Israelites wandering in the wilderness, or, like I said, a teenager behind the wheel of a car who makes a bad decision for these same reasons. So this threshold theory that we learned from Parshat Korach and that we learned from modern sociology is so important. And as much as it applies to Korach, it is amazing to think about how much more influenced we are by this in our modern society, right? If the snowball effect is enough to drive, Korach and his fellow Levites to rebel against Moses to their ultimate doom, right? And it's the number of people who are doing something that influences us to make decisions we might not otherwise make. What does that say in the age of social media and social networks, when we are pummeled by ideas from every direction? And it is so easy to get caught up in a movement to do things that you would not otherwise do just because there's a movement around it. These things can happen for good. A few years ago, you found me on a beach pouring a bucket of ice water over my head. Who pours a bucket of ice water over their head? That's a decision I would never make on my own. But this was all part of the ALS challenge, and millions of people across the country and around the world were dumping ice water on their head to benefit ALS. That's a good effect of threshold theory, right? It took a certain number of people that we saw on social media doing something before we thought we should do it as well. But more often than not, this threshold theory works in the reverse. Whether it's the movements we see on Facebook or other social networks, or even just the news cycle pummeling us with information. It's so easy to see these trends, whether they be political or social, and to get caught up in a movement. But the movement ultimately canceling out our better judgment and changing the way we make our regular moral and ethical decisions. So what do we do? How do you combat? How do you stay on the derech, stay on a good path in a world that is constantly confusing that by throwing all this bad information at us, trying to break our thresholds? Remember, when the threshold gets broken, it doesn't matter how much you've studied ethics. It doesn't matter your values. It doesn't matter how much Torah you know, because you're not making a conscious decision. Now you are simply following your social threshold decision-making process. So the only way we can protect ourselves against that, to make sure we stay on a good, true path, a path of Torah, a path of light, a path of holiness, is to raise our threshold, right? If we are going to be affected by these thresholds, then, and we want to stay on a good path where our own decision-making process, our morals and our ethics continue to be the things that guide our decision-making process, then we need to raise our threshold. So instead of being influenced by 2 or 10 or 20 or 50 people, it becomes so high that we remain independent in our decision-making process. But how? How do we raise our threshold? Well, ultimately, I believe that is what Judaism is really all about. It's one way to look at Judaism. Rabbis always say, and that's what Judaism's all about, right? Well, it is one of the ways to look at Jewish practice and what its ability to influence our lives, right? It's that the repeated doing of mitzvot, right? Those actions that we are responsible for from God and Torah. Every time we engage in those actions, our threshold raises a little bit. Right? It's not conscious thought. It's not study that does that, but it's actually doing the mitzvot. As one of my teachers, Alan Marinas, in Everyday Holiness, in his chapter about responsibility, says, right, making an effort to bear the burden of others as a conscious, deliberate practice diminishes the power of ego to commandeer your life, and also instills sensitivity in the soul that might otherwise not be there. And that's the key, I think, in this. Sensitivity in the soul that might not otherwise be there, right? Raising the threshold of that soul to be able to buffer against the influences around us. It continues, each act of support you undertake is an opportunity to develop finer sensitivity and elevate the soul you are. Elevate the soul you are. Elevate your threshold. Each act of support you undertake, each mitzvah you engage in, every time we look outside ourselves and towards God for guidance and act on that, it's the behavior that habituates us to doing good, so that we can't possibly think of doing bad. Every one of those elevates our soul, or we could say elevates our threshold. So Judaism girds us for the world around us. Judaism prepares us to be able to avoid the influence of the crowd and to make the right decisions on our own, not consciously, because that's not our choice, but habituates us to act the way that we know is right, even when we are affected by those influences around us. They just don't have the effect because our threshold is elevated. Our soul and our threshold is at such a high place. The great sage Hillel said in Pirkei Avot, "In a place where there are no men, strive to be a man." Right? That is all about what we're talking about. Right, that this mob mentality, when the mob rises up and there are no individual people acting on their own values, don't get caught up with them, but be your own individual person. Follow Torah, know what's right, and avoid that influence. But how? Well, Hillel says elsewhere in Pirkei Avot right? If I'm not for myself, who will I be? But he continues, and if I am only for myself, what am I? Right? We cannot go through only for ourselves. Ultimately, that destroys our ability to know who we are when push comes to shove and the mob is rising around us. We fail to see right from wrong because we're not habituated. But every time we practice responsibility for another person, every time we step up and say, I will be for myself, but I will also be for them, we raise our threshold. We allow ourselves to resist when others are heading in the wrong direction and to recognize when that's happening. We remain in a conscious state of choice, able to recognize right from wrong and not get caught up in these trends which so often lead us in a negative direction. I pray that we can all practice our Judaism, practice those behaviors, practice that kind of discipline, so that as we move forward into the future, buffeted on all sides, whether it's from social media or our friends or the television, by influences that are leading us in the wrong direction, that we remain conscious, we remain with our choices, and we remain sticking to our Torah and our moral code and our path that we know is good to help us do tikkun olam and heal this world. And I hope we all are able to achieve that in practicing our mitzvot, our responsibilities in the weeks and months ahead. Wish you all a happy summer. This will be the last one of these videos for some time, as I'm going up to Camp Ramah for a few weeks to teach, and looking forward to being there, and looking forward to checking in again with all of you in August. Shabbat Shalom.